This next section is going to be covering early childhood. Moving on from infancy, this is going to be roughly the ages from 2 to 6 that we'll be talking about. It's early childhood. And first we'll start out talking about the body and mind and developmental processes that relate to those two things. So the first thing that we can talk about is some body changes that we see. There are different growth patterns associated with different stages of development, and so in early childhood what we tend to see is that children become slimmer as the lower body lengthens. They no longer have such a round face and a round body. It starts to elongate more. They start to look more adult-like, really, is what you could say. So each year from age 2 to 6, well-nourished children add almost 3 inches in height and gain about 4.5 pounds in weight. And the center of gravity moves from the breastbone down to the belly button. And this is important because this is really one of the things that allows them to develop much greater balance. And of course, balance is going to be very important for doing a lot of the physical activities that we tend to associate with older children as opposed to younger children. In order for these body changes to take place, of course, we need to have certain nutritional needs met. So children need far fewer calories per pound of body weight than infants do, but they still need to make sure that they receive the essential vitamins and nutrients. And caloric intake in general. And while historically, throughout the existence of the human species, nutrition has been a difficult thing to attain, it's really quite the opposite in the last about 100 years or so. So in contrast to starvation being a big problem in many places, although it still, of course, is, now obesity is a much more frequent problem. Children in low-income families are especially vulnerable to obesity because their cultures tend to still guard against undernutrition, and their parents may rely on fast foods. Now, of course, there are a variety of reasons for this. Fast foods are often cheap and easy alternatives. There's a lot of controversy surrounding the types of foods that are often made available to kids, particularly in the younger years when they may not have the knowledge about what constitutes the proper nutrition. And so if we offer young children fast food types of snacks as opposed to fruits and vegetables, which are considered to be much more nutrient dense and healthy, that's one of the factors that underlies this obesity problem that we're facing right now. Overfeeding really is causing an epidemic of illnesses associated with obesity, particularly heart disease and diabetes. So, whereas heart disease is probably going to be much later in life, diabetes is becoming far more common in even in early childhood as well. Some children, we see this just right phenomenon here. This is actually really interesting because it kind of makes me think about obsessive compulsiveness or obsessive compulsive disorder. Everyone has sort of compulsive habits, behaviors that they tend to engage in somewhat ritually, sometimes unconsciously, but it's interesting that we see this in young children, this just right phenomenon, which looks in some ways remarkably like the symptoms that are often associated with obsessive compulsive syndromes. So some children insist on eating only certain foods prepared and presented in a particular way, and this rigidity is known as the just right phenomenon. It would be pathological in adults, but it tends to be rather normal in children under age 6. For instance, when 1,500 parents were surveyed about this, their 1 to 6 year olds, their responses indicated that 75% of 3-year-olds, which is the peak age, evidenced some just right tendency. Examples of this just right tendency that they reported were preferences to have things done in a particular order or in a certain way. They had a preference to wear or not wear certain clothes. They prepared for bedtime by engaging in a special activity, routine, or ritual, or had strong preferences for certain foods. It's often interesting to try to think about our own experiences with these things that we talk about in development. And fortunately, many of us have experience with either younger siblings or nephews in my case. So I often think about my nephew and the preferences that he has. When I play with my nephew, he is very quick to tell me, no, Tom, you don't do it like that, or no, it goes this way, type of thing. No matter what we're doing, whether we're throwing a ball or I'm pushing him on the swing or anything like that. He's always got a particular preference for things. He could be very picky at times about the clothes that he wears, and of course, he always needs his bedtime stories read to by his mother. So those are instances that I can think of that really illustrate the high prevalence of this just right phenomenon. In terms of motor skills, again, children develop all their motor skills spontaneously and diligently as they play. So play is actually a bit of a misnomer here, because play is almost like work, in the sense that they are developing skills. They're learning how to do new things through play. So it's really a nice time, and a time that adults usually reflect on and think about how nice it would be to be a child again. By age 6, most North Americans are able to ride tricycles, climb ladders, pump their legs on swings, throw and catch and kick balls. Muscle growth, brain maturation, and guided practice advance every gross motor skill. So we talked previously about the correspondence between motor skills and cognitive skills and sensory skills, because the way that we learn about the world is through our senses and through motorically acting on things in order to experience new things. And of course, this also shapes the way that we understand the world as well. So that's the cognitive component. Practice improves dexterity and advances fine motor skills, which involve small body movements. So again, previously we mentioned that the large muscle groups, or the gross motor skills, develop first. So just the ability to control your arms happens much earlier than the ability to control just your fingers. And again, you can see this in young children, early childhood, trying to pick up small things off of the floor. For instance, you'll notice that a 2-year-old might have some difficulty picking up a paperclip because they have difficulty getting their fingers around it, because it requires very fine motor dexterity, whereas a 3-year-old might be able to do this more easily. By age 2, a child's brain weighs 75% of what it will in adulthood, and extensive sprouting and pruning of dendrites has already taken place. The brain reaches 90% of adult weight by age 6. So in terms of the mass, the amount of brain tissue present, it's quite fully developed at this time. But if you think about what a 6-year-old is capable of cognitively, you can imagine that it's far from being fully developed. That is, just because the tissue, the brain tissue is there, does not mean that it's there in its permanent form. Particularly, it's the wiring of the connections between neurons in the brain that constitutes the greatest development that we see. And in particular, the development of connections involves the development of the coding along axons which come off of neurons, and that coding is called myelin. And myelin often is referred to as white matter, because of the way that it looks when you look at it under a microscope, and also in an MRI you can see it shows up sort of whitish, as opposed to the grayish appearance that cell bodies themselves have. So you can see the difference between cell bodies, which are often called gray matter, and axons, which are called white matter. This is a diagram. I know that this might be a little bit difficult to see, but it's a good diagram because it shows you some of the most important structures that we'll be talking about now and throughout really the duration of the course. So let's start over here. We've got a left and a right hemisphere, first of all, which perform somewhat different functions. And one thing that we could say about development is that there's less of a discrepancy early on in life between what the left hemisphere and right hemisphere does. That is, as adults, our left hemisphere tends to do certain things much better than our right hemisphere does, or is involved much more in certain behaviors. Particularly language is the big one that is associated with the left hemisphere. So the left hemisphere is largely responsible, although not completely, but largely responsible for language in adults, and the right hemisphere plays a relatively minor role in language. Yet in children, that lateralization is not nearly as marked. In other words, when I say lateralization, I mean to the side. Lateral means to the side. Lateralization means, in terms of brain functioning, that one behavior, in this case language, is located more so on one side as opposed to another. The opposite of lateralized is bilateral, which means to both sides. Okay, so we've got a left and a right hemisphere. We've got the front of the brain here, the back of the brain here. This front part is very important. It's the least developed in children as compared to adults. It doesn't fully develop until roughly our early 20s. And in particular, the frontal part called the prefrontal cortex. So that's kind of the most frontal portion of the frontal lobe. And the prefrontal cortex performs the brain's what are called executive functions. And executive functions include things like planning, selecting, and coordinating thoughts. Then you've got the auditory cortex located over here in the temporal lobe. This is for conscious processing of sounds. And then we've got some structures located underneath the cortex. So the other thing I should mention is that this outer portion here, as you can see, is called the cortex. And inside of the cortex here is one structure called the amygdala. This is a brain structure that's very important in terms of processing of emotion, and in particular fear, the emotion of fear. And right next to it is this structure here called the hippocampus. And this is an important structure involved in memory, specifically the formation of memories. Together, the amygdala and the hippocampus are part of the limbic system. Okay, and then we've got our cerebellum here, important in coordination and balance. And again, we said that coordination and balance are also the types of things that develop substantially in childhood. Here's our spinal cord, our occipital lobe, which processes visual information, a pituitary gland located right here, pituitary gland that's called the master endocrine gland. The endocrine system is a system of network, is a network of glands that are responsible for production and release of hormones. So the pituitary gland, since it's the master gland, often controls most of the production of other hormones throughout the body outside of the brain. The hypothalamus does a lot of the controlling of the pituitary gland, but it also controls functions such as eating, and it's also linked to emotion and reward. Then we've got our thalamus and the corpus callosum. So this corpus callosum here, I just mentioned a few minutes ago, white matter and axons. Well, the corpus callosum is made up of entirely white matter and axons. Again, those two terms are relatively synonymous. Axons have a whitish appearance, so the white matter that we see is usually a representation of axons, and it's made up predominantly of axons, almost entirely of axons really, because it connects the right hemisphere of our brain with our left hemisphere. Okay, so that's kind of a lot of information to try to take in about the brain and some of the structures and the functions, but it's very good to try to make some sense out of the organization and the structures in the brain and what they do, because anytime we talk about behavior, it's usually important to talk about the neural basis, or the the brain basis of behavior. And in order to really be able to do that, you need to have some conception of where these structures are located in the brain. Okay. So again, going back to what I was just talking about with the development of myelin along the axons, this myelination, the growth of myelin that surrounds the axons. So myelin is a fatty coating on the axons that speeds signals between neurons. So again, if we go back here, the corpus callosum right here is made up entirely of axons coated with myelin. That's what makes it look like it has that whitish appearance. And the primary reason for being able to think more quickly is due to the extensive myelination. So myelin, since it is involved in speeding up of the transmission of signals between neurons, is also going to help us think more quickly. So a gradual increase in myelin makes 5-year-olds much quicker than 3-year-olds, who themselves are, of course, much quicker than toddlers in terms of their speed of processing of information, how quickly they can think, in other words. One part of the brain that grows and myelinates rapidly, again, the corpus callosum. Okay, it's a band of nerve fibers that connects the left and right sides of the brain, as I just showed you. The growth of the corpus callosum makes communication between the two brain hemispheres more efficient, and this term that I used earlier, lateralization, literally means sidedness. It refers to the specialization in certain functions by each side of the brain, with one side dominant for specific activities. And again, the most common example when we talk about lateralization is language. Okay, so in 95% of people, it's their left hemisphere that controls the majority of their language abilities. Prefrontal cortex. Okay, maturation of the prefrontal cortex gradually enables children to focus attention and curb impulsiveness. So focus of attention and curbing impulsiveness, another way to say that would be to inhibit themselves from doing certain things. This is, once again, these are specific behaviors that we could label as those executive functions that you saw on the previous slide. Before such maturation, many children can be found to jump from task to task. They cannot stay quiet. They have a difficult time inhibiting themselves. So because the prefrontal cortex develops so much later than the rest of the brain, and because it's involved in these very complex behaviors, we tend to see children behave as if their frontal lobes are not fully functioning. And one example of this is a phenomenon called perseveration, which is when children persevere in or stick to one thought or action, unable to quit. There's a really good example of this in the textbook where children are shown cards that have different shapes on them and also have different colors. And of course, since there are different shapes and different colors, you could sort them in one of two ways. You could either sort the cards by shape, or you could sort them by color. And if you have children sort them by color first, they have a difficult time then switching from sorting by color to then sorting by shape, and vice versa. If you start them out sorting by shape, they have a difficult time switching to sort by color. And that's what we mean when we say perseveration. So from ages 2 to 6, maturation of the prefrontal cortex has several other notable benefits, including sleep becoming more regular, emotions becoming more nuanced and responsive, and temper tantrums subsiding. And again, these temper tantrums are subsiding in part because emotions become more well regulated, as we mentioned previously. And part of the reason that they become more well regulated is because we are able to inhibit ourselves better. So even though I may become upset about something as an adult, it doesn't mean that my emotions are going to come pouring out and I'm going to start crying, because I'm able to have some control over my emotions. I'm able to inhibit myself from displaying my emotions just because I may feel a certain way. Okay, so Piaget, we talked about his sensory motor stage of cognitive development before. From the ages of 2 to 6, this Piaget was concerned more with pre-operational thought. Okay, pre-operational means before logical operations or reasoning processes. In other words, what he's saying is that children are not able to use logical reasoning the same way that adults do because they are before logical operations. They're they haven't developed these yet. The child's verbal ability is what really permits symbolic thinking to take place, and of course, the best illustration of symbolic thinking is language. Language frees a child from the limits of sensory motor experience, which was again the preceding stage of cognitive development in Piaget's theory. Here are some of the characteristics of pre-operational thought. Centration is a characteristic whereby a child focuses or centers, hence the name centration, on one idea excluding all others. The example that I just gave a few minutes ago with the card sorting task, where you could sort either by the symbol or the shape on the card, or by color, and they have a difficult time thinking about both of those things at the same time because of this thing called centration. They tend to focus on just one or the other, or one to the exclusion of the other characteristic of the card. And in particular, egocentrism is not the type of egocentric that we typically use in common everyday language, but this was Piaget's term for children's tendency to think about the world entirely from their own perspective. Okay, egocentrism, ego meaning their selves, the centrism referring to their focusing on only one point of view, their own point of view. They also tend to show a focus on appearance. So children often ignore attributes that are not readily apparent. In other words, what's right in front of them is what they tend to focus on, and ignore the things that are more subtle and less apparent. Some additional characteristics of pre-operational thought. Static reasoning. This is a characteristic whereby a child thinks that nothing changes. Whatever it is now has always been and always will be. And we'll see a good example of this in just a minute. Same thing with irreversibility. These two are somewhat related. This is when a young child thinks that nothing can be undone. A thing cannot be restored to the way that it was before a change occurred. Conservation. This is the principle that the amount of a substance remains the same. In other words, it's conserved when its appearance changes. Again, these three are all pretty closely related. And animism, the belief that natural objects and phenomena are alive. The thing that I think about when I think of this term animism here is once again my nephew's some of the videos that he watches. I can't think of, or maybe it was in a book that I saw. But anyway, there was a tree that talked and it had a face on it, and children will pick up the idea that trees actually have facial expressions and can talk and have similar experiences like humans do. Okay, so here are some different tasks that Piaget had used to study cognitive development in children, to study the way that children think. And again, that's largely what Piaget's theory was a systematic studying of the types of errors that children make. So in these examples here, examples of conservation, you start out with 2 equal glasses of liquid. You pour one into a taller, narrower glass, so clearly we all know that the amount of liquid is still the same. But when you ask a child which one has more liquid in it, they say the taller one. Sometimes they may say the shorter one. But the reasoning behind this is that we believe that children are focusing again on one but not the other characteristic. So they're only focusing on the height without considering the shallower or the smaller width of the object. Same thing in these examples here, and these are all in your textbook, and they're the typical types of tasks that Piaget had used. Now, Lev Vygotsky, he had a slightly different take on learning or cognitive development. He had much more of an emphasis on the social aspects of learning. So he said that every aspect of a child's cognitive development is embedded in a social context, which in a lot of ways it is, really, because children learn extensively from their parents, from their peers, and from other adults that they interact with. A lot of times that's going to be teachers. He really said that they were apprentices in thinking. And by this he meant a person whose cognition is stimulated and directed by older and more skilled members of society. And so on the basis of that, he talked about zones of proximal development and scaffolding. A zone of proximal development, this was his term for either a cognitive or a physical skill that a person can exercise only with assistance, though not yet independently. So you can imagine that to just come up with a quick example, maybe tying one's shoe. Okay, maybe you can't remember all the steps to tying your shoe, but if somebody's there to remind you, to remind a small child, what are the steps in tying a shoe, they might be able to do it. So not independently, not on their own, but with a little bit of help from somebody who's more cognitively sophisticated, either an older child that can already tie their shoe, or an adult. This is referring to scaffolding, this facilitation that you get from a more advanced learner. This is temporary support that is tailored to a learner's needs and abilities and aimed at helping the learner master the next task in a given learning process. So again, using the shoe example, a child might not be able to tie his or her shoe by him or herself, but with a little bit of help, they can get there. He thought that a lot of this learning takes place through private speech. That we have internal dialogues that occur when people talk to themselves. So certainly adults do this too. Most of the time it's going to be silently, but in younger children there's a greater tendency for it to be out loud. So if I'm thinking about what do I have to do today, I usually think about these things. I have private speech going on in my mind. That's my internal dialogue. And social mediation, this is what he was talking about: human interaction that expands and advances understanding, often through words that one person uses to explain something to another. So again, there's a very social aspect to Vygotsky's theories here. Now, in addition to Vygotsky and Piaget's theory, children also have theories. We all have theories about how the way that the world works. Sometimes we develop our own theories. A lot of times we're taught about different theories. Theory is the idea that children attempt to explain everything they see and hear. And to me, this seems to make a lot of sense because, we all attribute reasons behind things. One example of this, if I can find a video of this on YouTube, I'll try to find one. But I've seen, they have experimental paradigms or research studies that use shapes on a computer screen, and you'll have one shape it would just be like a triangle. Okay, right where my cursor is right here, and it would be moving this way, and then you'd have another triangle right behind it, following that first triangle, and then it might go up this way, and then the other one would follow behind it again, and we sort of get the impression that the second triangle is following the first triangle, and really we're just talking about triangles here, but in an attempt to explain why we are seeing what we're seeing, we come up with this theory that this triangle is trying to follow the other one. So that's what theory refers to, this idea that children, and to some extent, like I said, adults do the same thing. They attempt to explain everything that they see and hear. Part of this, and so another theory that we've talked about previously is theory of mind. This is, we said, a development, a cognitive ability that takes place after the development of a sense of self, in which a person's theory of other people allows them to think about what they might be thinking. In order to have a theory of mind, children must realize that other people are not necessarily thinking the same thoughts that they themselves are, and that realization is seldom achieved before age 4. And again, there's another really good example of this in your textbook, where children are shown a box of crayons, and inside of the crayons there's candy. And before the child knows what's inside the box, you ask them, what do you think is in this box? And they say, of course, crayons. And then you open it up, and there's candy in there. And then if you ask them, if your friend came in the room right now, what would they think is in this crayon box? And they would say candy if they're about 2 or 3 years old. But if they're 4 years old, they'd be much more likely to say crayons. In other words, they say candy, the younger children, younger than age 4, because they're not taking into account that another child who doesn't know what's in there does not have access to the same knowledge, that they might be thinking something other than what they themselves are thinking about. Okay, that's what we mean when we say other people are not necessarily thinking the same thoughts that they themselves are. Okay, we've talked about language development to some extent before. Specifically, we talked about the development of the first few words, and a little bit about the way that children string words together to try to communicate thoughts. Well, language is again pivotal to every kind of cognition in early childhood. It's the thing that really frees them up from the here and now. To be able to talk about, say, a ball that's not actually in front of them, they really need language to do that. You could think about a ball to existing without using language, although the more language develops, the harder it is to think about ever thinking about a ball without using language to describe it. So early childhood is really a very sensitive period for language development. Sensitive period is contrasted with critical period, although they're both referring to the idea that there's a certain time in development when it's easiest to develop certain skills. And in this case, the early childhood is a sensitive period to master vocabulary, grammar, and pronunciation. So that tends to be why adults who pick up a second language later in life, they tend to not pronounce words the same way as a native speaker, and so they tend to keep their accents no matter how fluent they become. Whereas early childhood language learners of a second language, that is, they tend to be less likely to have an accent. So the average child knows about 500 words at age 2 and more than 10,000 words at age 6. And this is due to the naming explosion that we mentioned before. It becomes much more general. Verbs, adjectives, adverbs, and conjunctions, as well as many more nouns, are mastered. And a lot of this takes place not, of course, by being told what a word means, but by this thing called fast mapping. This is the speedy and sometimes imprecise way in which children learn new words by tentatively placing them in mental categories according to their perceived meaning. So again, an example of this that we probably use in our day-to-day lives is, maybe you hear me use a word for the first time, and maybe I don't define it for you, but you can tell just from the context in which I use the word approximately what that word means. And that's kind of what fast mapping is, and that's kind of and that's one of the ways that children learn to figure out what a word means. Basic grammar, again, this is developing as well. Grammar, of course, is the structures, techniques, and rules that communicate meaning. It includes things like word order, and word repetition, prefixes, suffixes, intonation, and emphasis. All those things are a part of grammar, and it's really, the grammar is the most difficult thing to pick up outside of early adulthood. It's not all that difficult to remember the translation of different words. For example, it's relatively easy to remember that hungry is hambre in Spanish, although it's much more difficult to try to remember how to use those words appropriately in their proper sequence and how to conjugate those things correctly and how to add endings and things like that. And what you tend to see is a lot of over-regularization. This is the application of rules of grammar even when exceptions occur, making the language seem more regular than it actually is. That's where the term over-regularization comes from. Examples of this would be, when you've got an abnormal plural word like mice instead of mouses, children will, of course, just assume that, well, if we add s onto things, it makes them plural. So if I add an s onto mouse, that refers to many mouses, as opposed to using the word mice. And the other thing is that if you correct them, you'll often find that they'll continue to use this over-regularization strategy until a more appropriate time in development when they start to develop the ability to correct themselves more. And the ability to correct themselves based on that feedback, that's also one of those things that we refer to as executive functions. Topics a little bit to talk about early childhood education. We could talk about early childhood education as being broken down into different sorts of formats. One of these formats is a child-centered program. Okay, child-centered programs refer to programs that stress children's natural inclination to learn through play rather than by following adult direction. So instead of having somebody at the front of a classroom lecturing to a group of students, or in this case, early childhood age children, the idea is to allow them to have more self-paced exploration, and there's a lot of focus on artistic expression because they're given much more autonomy in terms of what they do. If you could fast map that word there, autonomy, you might come to the conclusion that autonomy relates to their own decisions about their own choice to make decisions about what to do. These types of programs show the influence of Vygotsky, who thought that, again, children learn through play and with other children through cultural practices that structure life, and again do the majority of this learning through interacting with those who are a little more advanced. Some specific types of schools that utilize these programs are the Montessori schools, which emphasize individual pride and accomplishment, presenting literacy-related tasks, such as outlining letters and looking at books. And there are some in the New York City area, although they tend to be a bit more expensive, and so there's somewhat of a select group that gets into these. Same thing with schools that follow the this Reggio Emilia approach. She was an early childhood educator, this comes from a town in Italy where the instructors were using particular methods to try to encourage children's creativity in carefully designed settings, and that's sort of as good an idea as it might be. It's not very practical to try to educate all children in that format due to the high teacher to student ratios and the type of setting that's needed in order to use this type of approach. What tends to be much more common, I think, is the teacher-directed programs, which stress academic subjects taught by a teacher to an entire class. Children learn letters, numbers, shapes, and colors, as well as how to listen to the teacher and sit quietly. They make much more of a clear distinction between work and play, and are far less expensive, particularly due to the fact that the child-adult ratio is much higher. In other words, there are fewer adults for each child in those types of education programs. Then we also have intervention programs, such as the Project Head Start. This was the most widely spread, or is the most widely spread early childhood education program. It started in 1965 and was funded by the federal government. There's some controversy over the success of this program. At first, it was believed to be highly successful at raising children's intelligence, although there's some debate about to what extent we're really raising their intelligence, and if we are, how long these gains are being realized for. They seem to be fading, and there weren't a whole lot of highly controlled or well-researched studies of these programs at the beginning. So there's a bit more research out there now, but the firm conclusions are a little difficult to draw at this point. Again, switching gears, accidents are a leading cause of death worldwide for people under age 40, but they're particularly problematic for early childhood because of the fact that so many of them are preventable. That is, whereas teenagers, well, there's not as much control over them, so when there are accidents, there's less that we could do as adults to try to protect them. And when I say less, I don't mean to say that there's nothing that could be done. Certainly, laws are in place to try to protect teenagers, such as not being able to drive before 15 or 16, depending on the state you're in, things like that. Although 2 to 6-year-olds, it's believed that it's much easier to control or to avoid accidents because we have much greater supervision for 2 to 6-year-olds. And injury control or harm reduction, these are the practices that are aimed at trying to anticipate and control and thus prevent dangerous activities from taking place. And there are 3 different levels at which we could try to prevent injuries and maltreatment as opposed to just accidents. Primary prevention, these are actions that change overall background conditions to prevent some unwanted event or circumstance, such as an injury, disease, or abuse. Getting a vaccination would be, of course, a good example of a primary prevention. Secondary prevention are actions that avert harm in high-risk situations, such as stopping a car before it hits a pedestrian or installing traffic lights at dangerous intersections. Or, for instance, as it relates to specifically early childhood, developing car seats that are going to do a better job of protecting particularly young children. Tertiary prevention, these are actions that are usually immediate and effective medical treatment that's taken after an adverse event has already occurred, and so is really aimed at reducing the harm or preventing disability. Rather than preventing the occurrence of the event in and of itself. When we talk about, we first need to define what maltreatment is. Child maltreatment is intentional harm to or avoidable endangerment of anyone under the age of 18. So the intentional harm usually refers to child abuse, which is a deliberate action that's harmful to either a child's physical, emotional, or sexual well-being. And the avoidable endangerment of anyone refers to child neglect. Okay, because being neglected is certainly something that puts children in danger. And this refers to a failure to meet a child's basic physical, educational, or emotional needs. These are some signs of maltreatment that you can see. This is table 5.2 in the textbook for children aged 2 to 10. And to sort of summarize what we see here, these are injuries that do not fit an accidental explanation, such as bruises on both sides of a face. So, it's one thing to bump your head and get a bruise on your face. That's not that uncommon, but to have them on both sides of your face. Burns with a clear line between burned and unburned skin, falls that result in cuts rather than scrapes. So really you're looking at inconsistencies behind what suggests an accident and what suggests non-accidental type of injury. The consequences of maltreatment are very wide. Severely maltreated children suffer physiologically, academically, and socially in every culture, with the worst consequence that being that maltreated children come to consider other people to be hostile and exploitative. And what happens is that they this makes them fearful, aggressive, and lonely, and also puts them at greater risk of becoming individuals who will also maltreat others. The earlier the abuse starts and the longer it continues, the more trouble they will have with peers and adults. So that's why it's so important to try to avoid these things and correct them when they do take place. So again, we have 3 levels of prevention for maltreatment. The primary prevention would include things that, again, try to reduce financial stress, family isolation, and unwanted parenthood to try to prevent maltreatment from occurring in the first place. Secondary prevention would include home visits by nurses, high-quality daycare, and preventative social work, all designed to help, once again, high-risk families. And then, of course, tertiary prevention, which is far less ideal than the above 3, reduces harm when maltreatment has already occurred. It requires permanency planning and an effort to find a long-term solution to a problem, which a lot of times may involve removal from a home, in which case you're looking at either foster care or kinship care. Foster care being a legal, publicly supported system in which a maltreated children is removed from parents' custody and entrusted to another adult or family, which is then reimbursed for expenses incurred in meeting the child's needs. Or kinship care, which is quite common, is a form of foster care in which a relative of a maltreated child, oftentimes a grandparent, although not always, becomes the approved caregiver.